Very good to reconnect with you, and you're always polite. You're always courteous. You're always.
When I say this, you opened up a whole world for Karen and I, and even before I turned my camera on, I was just honestly looking around my room, going, I've got a picture of the 23rd Psalm in Chinese that we got at the Great Wall.
Right.
I've got hanging behind me a silk.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That is a little mini tapestry. I'm looking over my reminiscence case, a place where I keep mementos, and there's a mug from a Chinese school.
Uh-huh.
And I'm looking on this wall, and I've got some items from our trips. And when I study downstairs at my home study, if you ever visit us in Missouri, you'll realize right next to my study are terracotta soldiers, just everything, because we don't want to forget.
Yeah.
We wanted to go back.
This is a conversation. It is a Christian worldview, biblical worldview, and Christian education in the field application. So what did you observe in China? The opportunity and huge needs, not only for education, but particularly for Christian education.
Sure.
Do you remember any of this?
Oh, yes. I was definitely impressed by meeting people who were from China and hearing of their great desire for their children to get an education. And I'll just say this, here, like the American dream is to get a good job and have a house.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe education is the means to that.
Right.
In China, I got the impression they wanted, the priority was for their children to get an education.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to be the big thrust. The difference being that given the population of China and the number of higher ed institutions, it is far more difficult to get into higher education. It's more competitive. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's why there were at one time so many study abroad programs for Chinese students to come to, around the world, to the West, whether that was the United States or Canada or Europe, was to compensate and to also get them out to get a world-class education. Now, I would say this, as far as the need for Christian education, I'm not against, people sometimes think if you're a Christian educator, you're against state-run education.
Right.
And the simple fact is, I'm not. My wife went to Truman State University. Mm-hmm. It's a public college, a public university. And I even took some classes myself at a community college as part of my education. Right. So I'm not against, in any way, shape, or form, government or state-run education. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, that can always teach us the what. Mm-hmm. It can give us the content, but it can't sometimes give us the why. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we live.
You mean the general public education give you a lot of content and what, but for the lifetime goal and the moral basis.
Yes, character.
Yeah, character.
Your character, your virtues, your values.
Right.
There was a French educator in the 1700s who said, education without religion produces educated demons. And I'm like, you can't remove the why factor.
Right.
And so that biblical worldview that we sometimes talk about,
right,
it doesn't mean thinking like it's 2,000 years ago.
Right.
It's applying biblical principles to today's world,
right,
to ascertain what's important, what's our values,
right,
what direction should we be taking, what's good in society,
right,
what should we try to emulate, who should we try to embrace as our model.
Right.
And biblical worldview basically provides a frame around education,
right,
that provides the why. Why am I studying this?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, just a quick little note. I have been in Christian education, in higher ed, Christian higher education, for 29 years. I'm a product of Christian higher education. I have a bachelor's degree, 3 master's degrees, and 2 doctorates. Mm-hmm. And so I have studied Christian education and educational theory in general.
Mhm.
The point being, when I read theories of education, they want to focus on things like, well, let's be student focused.
Mhm.
And there's some good stuff for that, but it has some shortcomings when it's student focused,
Mhm.
because students sometimes don't know what they want to learn.
Right.
They don't know what they need to learn.
Mhm.
So somebody says, let's be society focused. Let's figure out what our culture needs and focus education to do that.
Mhm.
And that has some benefit. But the problem is it also has some backdrops. There's some problems that it can't address, because sometimes the needs of the individual are lost in the needs of the society.
Right.
Other times people say it should be content centered. Education's represented by a stack of books,
Uh-huh.
and we're just going to read through all this stuff and get all this content. But once again, content without application, content without it being relevant to the world today doesn't mean a whole lot.
Content without a character.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, that's why Christian Ed comes along and says, what if we made it God-centered?
Uh-huh.
What if education focused on glorifying God
Mhm.
by being the person he wants me to be,
Uh-huh.
by being the citizen he wants me to be,
Mhm.
a good citizen, which will develop a good society.
Right.
And also the content that I'm studying, I now study in relation to how do I use it to better myself,
Right.
and to be a better citizen.
So,
and by the way, you could even teacher-centered education.
Yeah.
Let's let the teacher be the expert. Well, that's helpful. I'm a teacher. I would love to be regarded as the expert.
Mhm.
But at the same time, teacher-centered can also have shortcomings.
Right.
When the teacher understands that they're a servant of God first,
Mhm.
and that my role is to help students grow not only intellectually, but in their heart, in their virtues, their character, and that's going to produce a better society, it brings all those other orientations into order.
So this is a very lovely conversation that you kind of shared a different perspective, kind of orientation, whatever centered
Mhm.
the education, but ideally, as you said, would be God-centered and be what we want to be. My question to you is that in your education experience, do you see some of the students come out of this, that God-centered and be whatever the
Mhm.
personality, the family, the society, the field, the professional field, they become what they want to become? Did you see some of these
Oh,
examples?
yes, because by saying we have a God-centered education, first off, it helps the student remember it's not about them.
Mhm.
The one student I can't teach is the student who thinks they already know everything.
Uh-huh.
The student who thinks it's all about them, so you can't tell me what to do. A God-centered education makes the student more humble,
Right.
and therefore they're seeking answers.
Right.
In the same way, a society of people, a collection of people who are too individualistic and it's all about me,
Right.
well, that's going to create a society that doesn't function well.
Mhm.
But a God-centered society goes, there's something more important than me that
Mhm.
transcends me. And so, for example, Christian education, and I serve as the vice president of academics at Central Christian College of the Bible. We're in Moberly, Missouri, but we also have extension sites in Florence, Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati, and we're working on putting one in St. Louis, Missouri.
Right.
But basically, we talk about education not being just informative, but transformative.
Uh-huh.
That we want it to transform the person. So that means education can't be a content dump. It has to be time spent with a more mature other to be mentored,
Uh-huh.
to give feedback, and to help develop that character.
Right. Quick question.
Please.
Question. How you differentiate education process from the church preaching, right?
Oh, yes.
And the students say, "Well, you're preaching. I heard about this. How do you do that?"
Sure. I think a couple of things, and I appreciate you drawing that distinction. It's not a matter of standing up on a stage and preaching. preaching to the choir sometimes. People want to hear it. But I would say this. When we teach in the classroom.
Uh-huh.
And unlike preaching, we have an audience that we can interact with.
Right.
You know, I mean, jokingly about preaching, I've not seen somebody raise their hand during a sermon.
Right.
To ask a question. Seeing hands raised, but nothing.
Right.
In a classroom, we have to be expected students are going to interact.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings about a whole new format, that it's not just me being the talking head in front of the class.
Right.
It's literally a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So in part, we do have courses that are primarily lecture,
Uh-huh.
but as they go up to their senior year and graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
what we see is a change in educational methodology
Mm-hmm.
that isn't just simply supplying content, but it's explaining and helping them reach an understanding.
Right.
And helping them make use of this knowledge in how they focus on life. So
Right.
one of the big things is to have that approach that says education is informative, but also transformative.
Right.
That's more important.
Right.
But also it takes place outside the classroom. It means your faculty, your teachers need to spend time with the student. Yeah, I mean, for example, I'll give an illustration. I'm teaching a class starting in October. It goes 8 weeks.
Uh-huh.
I've already been in communication with my students. They know what we're going to cover in class. I've given them videos to watch prior to class, and so they got the content. But in the class, we're going to do a lot of discussion because they've already read the books. They've seen my lectures on video. So when I get together with them, we're going to do dialogue. But then once a week, we have a coffee house on campus called the Harvest House. I'm going to meet with them over there, talk about the implications of what we're studying and how we ought to live in response to it. And it's because we want to spend time outside the classroom to really have that personal impact with the students.
One thing I observed, and I thought about it for a long time, is that an education stirred up curiosity for knowledge,
Yes.
for truth, for ability to make decisions, right decisions. Everybody first cares about his or her life path, making right decision, live a good life. You know, what about if I made a mistake because of ignorance? You
Sure.
know, and what about I cannot facing challenges because I lack of skills of articulating or reasoning out. So I think education, as I'm educated myself.
Sure. As new needs arise or new opportunity arrives on your desk, you've got to be prepared for it.
Right, right. So you still remember Dr. Keith Ray, the president?
Oh, yes.
Right. He mentioned about Christian education, why it is important, and also give me a lot of thinking. He says, throughout the history, when church revival have no Christian education, it's short-lived.
Correct.
Yeah, because revival stir up your heart and your passion for God. But if you don't train, have knowledge and skills and continuation pass on to
you can't keep the emotional fervor, the emotional high
right
of a revival.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be met with intellectual ability for
Right.
Christian education. And I give an illustration. One of my favorite classes to teach is history and philosophy of Christian education.
Oh,
May sound boring, but it's one of my favorite topics. I have a whole bookcase
wow.
filled with resources
I
on
love
it.
it.
But here's the thing. Every time I mention a famous educator, my students go, wait a second, Dr. Estep, isn't that a theologian? Well, yes, like Augustine may have been a great theologian, but he also ran a library and a school.
Mm-hmm.
Luther may have been a great reformer, but he also had an educational agenda that backed up his theological agenda.
Wow.
And what we quickly find out is if you try to have a theological movement, a revival, a reformation of any kind that doesn't have a Christian ed component to back it up, it's short-lived. It burns out.
Wow.
It's kind of like going on a mission trip, coming back on fire, but over time that fire burns out because there's nothing to sustain it. By this is as an educator, we found if after those mission trips, you design some actual engagements after the trip to talk about, now, what did we learn from it? How can we prepare for it better? When's our next trip? What do we need to share with the churches here? When we have things following it up that are of a more educational, that fervor for the trip stays on indefinitely.
Right.
And so I'm going, once again, I agree with Keith that, every major theologian, every major revival movement, anytime the churches seem to be resurging in culture, there's got to be an educational agenda to follow it up, or it just becomes short-lived. The fervor dies down, just like in anything that's emotionally based.
Right.
You go back to your baseline.
You reminded me at one time we talked about the short pamphlet or magazine. Sure. You, as an editor, a group of people had a series of the publication to train church deacons and elders.
Yes, that ministry is still going on very strongly. It's called E2 Effective Elders. We do workshops all over the country. We've spoken to over 8,000 elders. We've got about 12 books out.
Maybe I can work with you on that portion and translation.
I'll be honest, we've wanted stuff in Chinese. We've already got it in 5 other languages.
Wonderful.
I have a board meeting in about 2 weeks.
Okay,
to discuss future opportunities.
Yeah, remind this opportunity.
We even have 11 hours of video.
Oh,
as in like 15 to 20 minute segments.
Really?
On church leadership, addressing very, very small slices. How do you lead a meeting? How do you introduce change?
You send a sample to me. Send a sample to me. We can take a look, and we can translate a subtitle, and for some of the viewers to share.
I will make sure you get samples, and if you go to the website, you can actually see a sample video. And even download some free materials that we just give away. Yeah. And
please send me the website.
I will.
I'll quickly touch the topics of Lincoln Christian University. So I was mentioned by Congressman Bill Redmond that Lincoln was a heavyweight biblical worldview center.
Yes.
For education. Why was that? Is it because of Dr. Strauss or?
I taught for 18 years at Lincoln and loved it. Taught with Keith when Keith Ray was president. And even in its mission statement, it said essentially to equip people with a biblical worldview. That worldview focus really did start with Dr. Strauss. Dr. Strauss was a professor in the graduate school and seminary, and he wanted really everything to focus on. We live our worldview. Worldview is the frame of reference. It's our assumptions about reality. It's really the unspoken direction that we have in our mind. So he was the first one to really walk in and introduce the seminary to that. And then from that, and the number of graduates he had, the number of students he had, filtering into the undergrad, as those people literally came back to become professors and administrators, that worldview flavor was brought to the campus, put to the front. And ever since then, Lincoln has really been a place that focuses on worldview. At one time, it even had a worldview camp. Not sure if it does now, but at one time it did. We had worldview seminars, lectureships. And so it was indeed a powerhouse, still is, for teaching biblical worldview. One of the elements in the curriculum that was very telling was a series of classes called interdisciplinary studies, where they would study history. But let's say you went to the 6th century, they would study worldview in the 6th century then how that played out in music, literature, science, technology, architecture, art, how it influenced culture,
Right.
what literature was being written. And so literally you studied history through the lens of worldview and how it impacted the culture.
Mhm.
And they do that for 2.5 years. And so it's a very high emphasis on Christian worldview.
When you were at Lincoln Christian University, what are the positions you served as?
I served as a faculty member in the undergrad and the seminary. I was also the director of faculty development. I was also the director of academic assessment.
Mhm.
I then became the chairman of the ministries department. And my last title was Dean of Undergraduate Studies.
Mhm.
So I finished off as dean. And then when I left the institution, I went to Georgia and took a ministry. So, yeah.
So my last question is that, have you ever taken a Chinese student as doctoral student?
Well, here we don't have a doctoral degree,
Uh-huh.
but at other institutions I teach at,
Right.
because I teach it more than here. I've taught at Southern Baptist Theological as well as Dallas Theological Seminary
Mhm.
and Johnson University in Tennessee.
Right.
And they have doctoral programs and they have Chinese students in them.
Well, our time is up. So this is a very exciting and lovely conversation. I'd love to chat with you, especially go deep with Christian education, biblical worldview, China mission, whatever. I love to work with you and Karen for 10, 20 years.
Well, and we have relished our time spent with you and the opportunities you provided us. And anytime we can be of service on any level, to call us.
Yeah.
And I've got to give a shout out to you. I was driving through the country, through the United States with a group of students, called Jian Zhu and said, "Hey, I'm driving through Albuquerque." And he opened his house to us. And we got there and he had beverages and he had food and we had a wonderful conversation at his house. And I just thought, he is a gentleman. He is a host.
Thank you.
And so I just have always appreciated not just what he does, but who he is.
Thank you.
So,
Appreciate very much the conversation, and I will share our exciting conversation with our viewers, and hopefully, we can invite you back and talk about more.
excellent. Be glad to.
Thank you.